All right, I'm very happy to get a chance to speak with the Vehicle Dynamics Manager at Mazda, Dave Coleman. Dave, we are driving the brand new 2024 Mazda CX-90. There's a lot of inherent vehicle dynamics goodness built into this thing.
Yeah.
You've got a longitudinally mounted engine, is rear wheel drive based setup, even though it's an all-wheel drive car.
Right.
You've got double wishbone front suspension, 5-link multi-link rear suspension. How did you manage to get so much driver enthusiast friendly stuff into a 3-row SUV?
It's the Mazda badge on the building. Really, we are trying to make a Miata out of everything we build, and so that's sort of where our soul is at.
So these weren't fights you had to win. This was just kind of built into what this car was going to be.
Yeah.
But this is a departure from the CX-9, because the CX-9 was a little bit more of your traditional mainstream 3-row SUV, wasn't it?
Yeah, so the CX-9, actually, that platform was based on the Mazda 3 platform. It was the ultimate stretch of how big that platform could go. And a couple of years back, we sort of made a decision as a company that we want to sort of move ourselves into a more premium position instead of just, duking it out for the cheapest car. We already had the driving dynamics and design and the quality that sort of raise us above the fray a little bit, but to really be convincing as a premium brand and have people just think of that naturally without us having to say it. You need to start with an architecture that sort of raises the bar. And our idea of what a premium vehicle is a car that will do more than you ask of it. Right, you never are running into its limits. It does whatever you want it to do. Starting with a rear drive architecture, with a higher power output capability, that's all part of that game. Like, you start by, okay, we want to have this much power. Well, that means we've got to drive the wheels that all the weight transfers onto when you accelerate. You want to be able to do whatever people are asking. If they want to tow a 5,000-pound trailer, they can do it. They're carrying 8 people, they can do it. All that is demanding a rear-wheel drive platform. That's where all the load is going in that car, right?
Absolutely. And there are some interesting technologies in this car. So Mazda had this technology for a few years now, this understeer mitigation, where you apply just a little bit of front brake to allow the car to turn in, give a little bit of load to the front end and allow it to turn in a little sharper. But now you have something called kinetic posture control, which actually breaks a little bit of the inside rear brake to help mitigate some of those control, make it feel a little bit more linear, and help actually reduce body roll.
So let me walk you through those a little bit, because that's a little bit off of how we're actually doing it. Most of our front-wheel drive based cars use, or all of them, use what we call G-vectoring control.
G-vectoring, yes.
Which a lot of people confuse with torque vectoring, which is because vectoring, right? Obviously, language reasons. But what we're doing is different. We're not actually braking the inside front tire at turn-in. What we're doing is we're weight transferring onto the front tires by briefly and very subtly reducing engine torque for a second.
You're cutting torque a little bit.
And so that's a weight transfer trick, just like if you were left foot braking, but a little more subtle and faster, right? And we do a little drag of the outside front brake on corner exit to help the car come out of the corner.
Interesting.
Right? A torque vectoring system will tend to drag the inside front tire and try to kind of add a yaw moment. And we don't want the yaw of the car to come from an uneven distribution of drive, because that doesn't feel natural. We're targeting this natural motion of a consistent way that the car moves, and the car's yaw motion should come from the tires turning, and you weight those tires, they'll turn more naturally, more consistently.
Gotcha.
So that's the basis of G-vectoring control.
Understood, okay.
So as great as that system is, we don't use it in this car. Now, why is that? That's because when you try to do weight transfer from a rear drive car, you're coming through the rear suspension, and the rear suspension geometry has some anti-squat, anti-dive geometry, which means when you pull back on those rear wheels, trying to make that weight transfer, they're pulling the back of the car down a little bit.
So the kinematics are off.
The kinematics are off.
Yeah.
Which is why it's kinematic posture control, not kinetic posture control.
Did I say it wrong?
Yeah, well,
okay.
kinetic posture control was one of the names we almost called it.
Okay,
we decided not to, because really it was the suspension kinematics that we're doing.
Because I already trademarked that.
Right.
It had a hashtag trademark, yeah.
So yeah, the suspension kinematics are such that when you pull back on the wheels, they pull the back of the car down a little bit. And so the natural motion that we're getting from G-vectoring control doesn't work through a rear drive car. And this is something we've been working on for years. Before this platform was developed, we were trying to figure out how do we do GVC on the MX-5. Like this great system that makes the steering response more precise, and our best steering car can't use it. So it was so frustrating.
Yeah.
And we finally came up with a different mechanism to come to a similar result. And it's not similar result in terms of weighting the front tires, it's a similar result in terms of making the driver feel like the car is doing exactly what they want. And that is to suppress a little bit of the body roll and a little bit of the pitch and heave by dragging the inside rear brake.
So this does apply brake, this one,
does
the
apply
Kinematic.
brake. It does apply the inside brake. And so it sounds like, all right, well, that's the same thing that a torque vectoring system would do. But it turns out if you actually measure the yaw rate of the car, we're not changing the yaw rate with that brake because the amount of braking force is so small. We actually would have to do 10 times a higher braking force to make the car yaw. But this tiny amount of braking is just pulling the inside corner of the car down a little bit and keeping the suspension in the middle of its stroke. It behaves really almost as a mechanical system. So if you really want to get nerdy, G-vectoring control responds to the driver's steering input. It's actually looking at the speed of the steering input. So it's very much looking at the driver's input and making the car respond to that input. Kinematic posture control is behaving almost as a mechanical system. The rear wheels start moving at slightly different speeds, and in proportion to that difference in rear wheel speed, it starts dragging the rear brake.
So you're looking at the difference of the inside and outside wheel speed on the axle.
On the rear axle, yep.
And then that gives you a sense of the corner radius.
Right.
And with that, you apply X amount of kinematic.
Dragging that brake just in proportion to that speed differential.
Interesting.
So it's just making the mechanical behavior of the car. As it turns this much, it pulls the inside down this much, very, very consistently.
And it does so that the rear, this is acting on the rear axle,
right.
But it's so that the rear axle follows the front axle more naturally?
It's just taking out a little bit of the rear body roll, a little bit of the forward pitch, and a little bit, like if you measure roll, pitch, and heave with and without the system, they all come down a little bit.
Yeah, sure.
Subjectively, what it does, we don't put a switch in there, you can't turn it off.
Right.
But when I drive a car that has a switch in it, you don't. It's one of those things, just like G-vectoring control, where you have to drive it with the system. You're like, yeah, this feels totally natural, that's fine. And then you switch it off, and you're like, oh, things are slightly wrong. And it's really subtle, but if you could switch it on and off, it's quite noticeable.
Now, does this system, because it affects how much the body rolls, does that change your need for anti-roll bars on the car?
I would have said no, except that it did. That wasn't our intention, but when we were tuning this car, we ended up removing the rear sway bar that we originally had on it.
It's not there anymore.
It doesn't have a rear sway bar now. And that's because that helped the balance of the car in a lot of other ways, and it would have gotten things a little bit too hairy in the back, and the roll amount would have been too much, except we just turned up the KPC a little bit, and like, oh, this works out great.
Well,
so we ended up using it for that.
Well, and there's an inherent advantage. I mean, because anti-roll bars actually hurt your ride when you're going over bumps and stuff.
Side.
Exactly right. So being able to pull that out, but not lose the capability of what an anti-roll bar is.
Not lose the roll control that it was giving you. Yeah.
And then you're ultimately, in terms of hardware, you're basically just using anti-lock brake controls, right? It's being able to just apply a little bit of brake to a single brake.
The hydraulic module that does the anti-lock brakes and the traction control and everything else is what's doing that. Yeah.
All right. So there was another neat trick that you guys talked about, and it was the fact that all CX-90s are all-wheel drive, and I think now it's actually all Mazda SUVs.
SUVs, yeah.
Yeah. So we're waiting on the all-wheel drive Miata, but we'll get to that later. The all-wheel drive system, it changes its torque distribution based on weight transfer or load transfer.
Right.
How does it do that, and why does it do that?
So let's start with the why. We want to figure out which tires have the most grip and drive those. If we're on a slippery surface, we don't want to react to a spinning tire and then recover. We'd like to anticipate what's going to happen and put the torque where it needs to be before there's any slip. That gives you really consistent driving dynamics, right? The best predictor of where the grip is going to be is which tire is pushing hardest into the ground. No matter what surface you're on, it's mu times normal force is how much traction you have, right?
So technically, you're saying the same thing, but it's mu times normal force is friction.
Right.
Yeah, so it's friction coefficient, normal force, that's friction force.
Right.
And you're saying the more friction force, the better.
Right, exactly. That's the tire with the most friction force available is the one that can handle the most torque. So let's base our algorithm around that. We know the center of gravity height, we know the wheelbase, we know the G-forces on the car. All this data is there, so let's just calculate the weight transfer live and then send torque to the axle that's going to have the most grip. So
that's very logical, but
right.
yeah, how do you do that? Because the reason why I ask is the first thing I thought of was, oh, well, your adaptive shock absorbers probably have sensors built in to, how it measures stuff. It's like, but you don't have adaptive shock absorbers, so.
Right, so yeah, we're not actually looking at the stroke of the suspension. We're just looking at the dynamics of the car. We have a 3-axis G sensor in the car.
Oh, so it's based on the amount of loading you feel.
It's on the G-force. The G-force is going to drive force onto those tires, and so we do it
Gotcha. So you can, that's a linear path of the more G's goes to the front, the more load transfer goes to the front, and it's as straightforward as that.
Right. And then we can tell how much we're cornering, and we know how the car is going to behave in a corner and what we need to do differently in a cornering condition. There's that algorithm that's following weight transfer. There is still a backup algorithm that's looking for wheel slip in case there was some difference in mu between this tire and this tire that made something unusual happen.
Split mu happens all the time.
It happens all the time, so we got to watch out for that. And then we have another algorithm that's looking at the driver's steering input, because as we send torque from the rear to the front, the way we do that is by a clutch that connects the front and rear wheels. And of course, if the front and rear wheels the clutch is locked and they're going they're getting exactly the same torque, they can't go different speeds. And when you turn, of course, they want to go different speeds.
Exactly right.
Right. So any amount of torque that we send to the front starts loading this clutch pack. Then this clutch pack, when they go different speeds, the clutches start going different speeds, and they start being a little bit of drag. And that drag damps the car's steering response. So it creates some yaw damping. So initially, early on, this basic idea of driving two wheels and having a clutch drive the other two wheels has been around for decades. And when the control systems were really dumb and simple and reactive, that yaw damping trade-off with when you split torque to the other axle, that was a negative point. Now it's a tool that we use to make the car drive better.
Interesting.
So those first two algorithms are splitting torque based on traction. When you turn the wheel, there's another algorithm that trims out the torque from those first two and starts reducing the yaw damping, so the car will respond to the driver's steering input naturally.
Interesting.
Right? Fine-tuning that steering one gets us to really get the right steering feedback so that the car communicates to the driver how it's going to go around a corner.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
You think about when you go around a corner, you're really looking at this path and turning this thing and hoping the car goes where you want to do, and you've got to subconsciously judge how much do I turn the wheel to make this happen. And if you have a car with no steering feedback at all, you just turn the wheel and wait and see what the car does, and then adjust, and then adjust, and adjust, and you just do this throughout the whole corner. And cars with bad steering feedback, you'll see drivers doing this through the whole corner. If the steering torque communicates what's happening at the tire, you know what the car is going to do just as you turn in, and so you stop turning in, run, and it's doing the right thing. And the way we judge if we've tuned the car right is by watching the driver's steering input. And if they make one input and track through the corner, then we tuned it right. Our measurement is the human in the car.
It's really interesting learning some more of this detail of how this stuff works. Dave Coleman, thank you so much.
Absolutely.
Good feel, good transitions from right to left. I've got a good sense of how much grip I have, even though I don't have a ton with the wet road.